And you never, Paul calls it being under the curse of the law. Chapter 3, verse 13. You're under its curse. Because the law is relentless. Law doesn't cut you any slack. It doesn't grade on a curve. You got to have A+. You got to do it all the time. And you have to do it perfectly. And so, Paul likens it in chapter 5, in verse 2, or verse 1, to a yoke. And it is not a yoke that fits. I want you to look at an Old Testament passage, which I think he has in mind here, or at least one of the principles he has in mind, in Leviticus 26. God often used animals to teach people lessons. You ever notice that? Jesus used the birds in Matthew 6 to teach us a lesson. He used the grass of the field to teach us a lesson, the flowers. Well, he uses animals too. Paul used an animal in 1 Corinthians 9 when he's talking about supporting a preacher. Didn't he? Yeah, don't muzzle the ox that treads out the corn. So Leviticus 26, God's got lessons all around us if we'll just pay attention. Leviticus 26, verse 13. This is the one I think I'm thinking about. Let's see if that's it. Yeah. Well, that's not the animal, but it is a good one. Leviticus 26:13. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt so that you would not be slaves to the Egyptians. I broke the yoke and enabled you to walk with your heads held high. Now, do you remember he had a he had an illustration here of what a yoke can do sometimes to a person. The one I had in mind was the yoke that didn't fit the oxen. You know, and I'm trying to think where that is now, but some of you may scrounge around your concordance and find it for me. But you put an animal into a yoke that doesn't fit him, it chafes him, and the scriptures tell you what's going to happen. Well, you put a human being in that kind of yoke. And here's what's going to happen. The Egyptians, you know how they made those huge pyramids? Somebody had to pull the load. Somebody got to get strapped with a yoke. And do you know when you stack too much of a load on a human being day after day after day, what happens to their posture? Yeah, they have a permanent bend. You ever seen someone who can't walk standing straight up? Walks like this? I got an inspiration at my athletic club from a person I see walking, an old man. He walks in there to work out, and he walks in, he can't straighten up. I don't know what happened, but I admire him. He's an inspiration to me because he's in there to work out. Try to strengthen his back and his body. You can see him stretching and doing everything he can just to... Well, that's what happens when you put a human being in a yoke that doesn't fit. And the law does not fit. Living under God's law as a means of justification, it doesn't fit a human being. It'll break them. In Acts 15, and let me do this passage and then take David's question. In Acts 15, I think it's Peter who makes this statement about the law and trying to live under it to gain your acceptance from God. There's nothing wrong with the law, all right? Paul says in Romans 7, it's good, it's wonderful. My mind agrees it's good and wonderful. There's nothing wrong with misusing it. That's what's wrong. using it to try to gain your acceptance from God. Acts 15. Verse 10, Peter says, "Now then, why do you try to test God by putting on the necks of the disciples a yoke that neither we nor our fathers have been able to bear?" You know we can't do this. You know it doesn't fit. Why are we going back to that? It's not worked. Israel is an example of a people where it didn't work. So that's why we have the new covenant. One covenant is from Sinai and bears children who are to be slaves. This is Hagar. Hagar stands for Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the present city of Jerusalem. Now he introduces the city, and I think he's just talking about the nation of Israel. You know, whenever you hear on TV, Washington says, what do you think of? That's the government. That's the United States. Capital city stands for the whole nation. So he's saying Jerusalem. Hagar stands for Mount Sinai in Arabia, corresponds to the present city of Jerusalem because she is in slavery with her children. The city of Jerusalem, where God's temple is. The glorious temple, where you offer sacrifice. The epitome of keeping the laws of God. And the Judaizers were holding that up as the city, the holy city. And Paul says, that's a city full of slaves. Now I want to ask you this question. How did Hagar and Ishmael get involved in this thing with Sarah and Abraham having a baby? Huh? Okay. Now, did Sarah hear the promise of God like Abraham? Yeah. She heard the promise of God. You're going to have a baby. And what was her first response? She just burst out laughing. Well, that's normal. I mean, isn't it? It'd be normal to yeah. But then she got to thinking, you know, I don't know if God knows what he's doing or not. I don't know. How's he going to pull this off? How can he do that? And then her human reasoning took over and said, you know, we've got to help God. We have to find a way to kind of, here, God, you need our assistance in this. Absolutely. That's the whole lesson here. This is what second guessing God gets you.
Just like Adam and Eve all over again.
Yeah.
God creates humanity in his image. You're going to be like me. Eve gets to thinking about it and says, if I eat that fruit, I'll be wise, knowing good and evil, like God. She reaches out and takes it, and he gives it to her husband. Says, join me in this. It's the same thing with Sarah. God has a promise, and she thinks about it, and the devil doesn't show up in this story, but it's the same sort of temptation.
Yeah.
She reaches out, exercises her own power, her own control over her slave, like Eve was put over the garden. She's over Hagar. She misuses this thing and carries Abraham off into it with her.
The toughest thing for me to do is wait on the Lord. Because it's his timing. And my timing messes things up. His timing is perfect every time. So the interval between when he makes the promise to me and I have to see the solution, that interval is always a time of temptation. Not waiting, getting in a hurry, panicking, getting anxious, thinking this is not working. I've got to intervene here. I've got to do something. And that's when we get into trouble. And fortunately, God has forgiven me over and over again because I'm a very impatient person, and I have made many blunders because of the impatience. Okay. The Jerusalem that is above, she is our mother. And we've already discussed this, so we're not going to get back into it. But if you want to read how he ties Isaiah 53 and 54 into this section, go back and read those 2 chapters. Don't forget about 53. Don't just read 54. Because 53, in verse 11, the Messiah has offspring, children. And that's the children he's talking about here. When the Messiah is announced in Isaiah 53, Isaiah has offspring. Isaiah says the Messiah has offspring, and that offspring will prosper. Justin. Okay.
So at the beginning of class, we talked about how we're progressively trying to look more like Christ and what we do to get there, our role. Well, I think that's the flip side of what we just talked about. We have to let that happen in a progressive way. We can't just get there all at once.
Good point.
The natural reaction for everyone to try to do their best to help any kind of process along. But we can't put ourselves there. We can't rush into it. It's got to happen.
Good point. Very good point. David.
Going back to the yoke, Matthew 11, chapter verse 28 and 30, Christ says, "Come unto me, all of you that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your soul. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light."
Very good. Now, very glad very thankful you brought that verse up because out of Matthew chapter 11, where that is, closing that chapter, Jesus contrasting his yoke with the yoke of the law, because the rabbis used the yoke as a metaphor for the law, and they said the yoke fits. And Jesus goes into chapter 12, and there are 3 examples of his yoke versus the yoke of the law. Matthew contrasts for us 2 ways of living like Jesus and the disciples, or living under the yoke of the law. So, glad you brought that up. That's a great illustration from the gospel of what it means to be under one yoke or the other. Now let's go down to verse 28 and finish up this chapter 4. "Now you, brothers, like Isaac, you're not like Ishmael as the Gentiles, you're like Isaac. You're the favored son. You're the son that Sarah says, send Hagar away. That boy cannot have any of the inheritance. Only my son, Isaac, can have the inheritance." And he says, you're not like Ishmael, you're like Isaac. You're children of promise. You're not children of the law, you're children of promise. God made a promise to you through Jesus Christ that through his death he would save you, he would justify you. You put your trust in that, you're just like Isaac. You're a child of promise. You required God's intervention to save you. You couldn't save yourself. I can't save myself. I've got to have God save me. Both when I become a Christian and if I'm meant to enter into heaven. It's a life of faith from the first day till last. At that time, the son born in ordinary way, who was that? Ishmael, persecuted the son born by the power of the Spirit. Read the story. Go back in Genesis and read the story. That's true. Ishmael persecuted Isaac. It's the same now. It's happening again. But what does the Scripture say? Then he just turns this on its head. He reverses their argument. God is saying, I only take children of promise. I do not, and give my inheritance to them. I do not give my inheritance to people who insist on saving themselves under the law. In fact, in chapter 5 says, Paul says, if you do that, you become alienated from the Christ, the Messiah. You have fallen from grace. Chapter 4 and verse 4. Look at that. That's what's at stake. Okay. Therefore, brothers, verse 31, here's the conclusion. We are not children of the slave woman, but of the free woman. Our mama is free, and therefore we are free. So it's your mother who counts, Paul says, not your father. You're the mother. Your mother is the free. You're part of the bride of Jesus Christ, and she's free. Okay, for next week, read chapter 5. We're going to be talking about how to walk in the Spirit, and we've just laid the foundation for that. Walking in the Spirit is believing in the gospel. So read chapters 5 and 6, and I want you to look particularly at the first 10 verses of chapter 6, and we're going to learn how to be one another's counselors and people helpers from chapter 6. And I want you to answer this question. Who is spiritual enough to restore people to the faith? Because that's what he says. You who are spiritual, chapter 6, verse 1, restore one another. Who's spiritual enough? What's he talking about there? Am I spiritual enough to help somebody come back to the faith, restore them? One who's been led astray? What qualifies me to do that? So we'll be looking at that and then the argument in chapter 5. So thank you for your coming and thank you for your attention.